Growth hormone regrows the thymus, but it has side effects. One of the side effects that was most prominent to me at the time is that it blocks insulin effectiveness. So as we get older, our insulin becomes less and less effective. In other words, we suffer from insulin insensitivity. And as insulin sensitivity goes down, we become fat, and then we become atherosclerotic, and then you have heart disease, and everything else sort of follows from that.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Longevity Roadmap. Before I begin today, I just wanted to remind you that there is a longevity coaching program that I have. If you go to longevityroadmap.com, you can check that out. Program with one-on-one coaching with me as well. It is something that I think that if you are really focused on trying to optimize your health with, the most science involved, this would be a great opportunity for you. I encourage you to check it out. Again, it's at longevityroadmap.com. As far as today's show, this is a show that I was really looking forward to recording. And the reason is that Greg Fahy's a guy I have actually followed for a couple of years. And I actually knew about his Fahy protocol a while back. And it was really interesting to get to actually talk to him about this. At the heart of Dr. Fahy's research, and I would say his theories on longevity, lies the gland called the thymus gland. It's a small but very important organ that's really essential for immune function. The thymus is responsible for generating T cells, which protect the body against infections and cancer. However, it undergoes a dramatic decline with age, which we know as something called immunosenescence. What I found really fascinating about this interview, and I want you to focus in on this concept, is that Dr. Fahy kind of was drawn to the thymus because of its programmed shrinkage. It starts shrinking, and when it does that, it's an indication of aging. It's one of the earliest indications of aging, and it's triggered during puberty. It's basically programmed to shrink into nothing as we get older and older. So in that regard, it's like programmed obsolescence of us. We think of aging a lot of times as wear and tear, but what he noticed was that the thymus follows a programmed pattern of decline. So in that regard, it's kind of like menopause, right? In women as well. What it suggests is that there is a programmed end to our lives that happens as well. And that's really interesting because at the cellular level, there's programmed cell death called apoptosis. So this is kind of like programmed cell death in us. And what he found was that early animal studies showed that you could basically reverse this phenomena in rats. And that breakthrough ultimately led him to the first TRIIM trial, which we'll get into in this interview. Bottom line is the thymus might be, in my opinion, based on like everything I see out there, one of the most ignored elements of this whole aging longevity problem that we have. What it made me think is that people need to kind of include that in their protocols. It may not be just a matter of cellular senescence. It may not be a matter of epigenetic drift. In fact, these might be downstream to the fact that you have an ineffective thymus creating an immune system that is not working very well in the first place. Anyway, fascinating interview. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll have that right after these messages. Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. Today, my guest is Dr. Greg Fahy. He's a pioneering biomedical researcher with over 4 decades of groundbreaking work in cryobiology, aging research, and regenerative medicine. He is the PhD in pharmacology and cryobiology, has dedicated his career to understanding and potentially reversing the biological mechanisms of aging. He's currently serving as the Chief Scientific Officer at 21st Century Medicine. He is, again, internationally recognized for his innovative research into thymus regeneration, epigenetic age reversal, organ preservation techniques. His multidisciplinary approach bridges complex fields, including immunology, pharmacology, and gerontology. Dr. Fahy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Buck. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you. It's interesting. At first, I just, with all the different things that you've been a part of with research, how did you land on this field of aging? What got you interested?
I've been interested in aging for a long time. I read my first book on aging when I was in high school. It just captured my imagination. It was a book called The Process of Aging by Alex Comfort. It's for a lay audience, and that's appropriate for a high school senior, but the theories of aging and, all of the considerations about how humanity has reacted to aging in the past were really, really interesting to me. So I ended up teaching a course on aging when I was in college, and really was interested in going into that as a field of research, but wasn't able to do that until recently.
With regard to the research that you've been doing, a lot of it's using research on the thymus.
Yes.
The thymus, just so people know, it's sort of central to immune function, but tends to decline with age, contributes to immunosenescence. Why did you choose to focus on the thymus in particular as a target for reversing aging? And, how does improved immune function impact overall health span and lifespan?
I got interested in the thymus for a couple of reasons. For one thing, my orientation toward aging from the very beginning was always that it seemed to be like a biologically controlled process rather than just a bunch of wear and tear. And I was kind of looking for models that would kind of illustrate that. And the first one that comes to mind is the ovary, right? So when human females go through menopause, everything changes, and that's considered kind of a programmed aging phenomenon. But it turns out that the thymus is a much more dramatic example, and it's universal. It's not specialized for a particular sex, and it happens when we're very young. As a matter of fact, it's the first thing that changes, that introduces aging into the body. And that's triggered by puberty, which again relates indirectly back to the female menopause story. But essentially, it is what then programs a great deal of aging that takes place later in life. And so that was one reason I was kind of predisposed to be interested in the thymus, because of this sort of programmed aging aspect of it. But the other reason was that there was a paper that was published in PNAS at the end of the 1980s that showed that thymus reversal, at least in old rats, could be reversed or prevented. And I thought that was a blockbuster observation. I still think it was, but it was ignored pretty much. So I was driven to get into the research myself in order to bring that discovery into the human realm.
I think it's kind of interesting. What you're suggesting is the fact that there is a, sort of an organ level program cell life and death pattern actually kind of makes it more likely that there's a way to intervene
exactly
in that process.
Exactly.
Is that a fair assessment?
Scotty once said in one of the Star Trek movies, the more complicated the plumbing, the easier it is to stop it up, right? So, if we have mechanisms that undo aging, we can screw up those mechanisms and not age, or at least not age in the same way. Whereas if everything is just a downhill entropy increasing thing, there's not much you can do about that. If aging is actually biologically induced, then it's relatively easy to block that process. Whereas if it's just wear and tear, there's not much that you can do about it. And there are several examples in which if you maim an animal in very important ways, they live longer rather than shorter. So if you screw up their pituitary gland, they live longer. If you poison them with neurotransmitters, they live longer. There's all kinds of things that if aging was just wear and tear, if you mutate an animal, it should make it worse rather than better. But it turns out if you do a single gene mutation in certain species, they will live 10 times longer. I think that there's very strong aging that aging is very strong evidence that aging is under biological control. And if we can figure out what some of those control mechanisms are, then we can go in and override them.
One of the things that you've been, actually the first thing that I saw with regard to your research was a few years ago. I guess you would pronounce it the TRIIM study. It's a TRIIM study.
Yeah, right.
A landmark demonstrating the thymus gland could be regenerated, basically, and that epigenetic aging could be reversed in humans. Can you talk about sort of the choice of the cocktail there, which was growth hormone, DHEA, and metformin, and how you think that achieved what you found?
The reason that we chose those three agents in combination with each other is because growth hormone regrows the thymus, but it has side effects. One of the side effects that was most prominent to me at the time is that it blocks insulin effectiveness. So as we get older, our insulin becomes less and less effective. In other words, we suffer from insulin insensitivity. And as insulin sensitivity goes down, we become fat, and then we become atherosclerotic, and then you have heart disease, and everything else sort of follows from that. You become susceptible to hypertension and stroke and so on and so forth. And if you put animals on calorie restriction, insulin sensitivity increases, and that may be a significant reason why calorie restriction helps. So here we have a situation in which we know that if we apply growth hormone to a human or to an animal, we can regrow the thymus, but we also block insulin sensitivity, which is a pro-aging effect. And so it would be kind of silly to try to counteract one aspect of aging by increasing another aspect of aging. But fortunately, the other two elements of the cocktail provide a solution to that problem. One of the things that occurred to me is that if you give growth hormone to an older person, they become insulin insensitive. They become sort of diabetic-like. But young people have tons of growth hormone and they're not diabetic at all. So I thought, well, what's different between a young person and an old person? And one other thing that's different between a young person and an old person is pretty obvious, is that young people have a lot of a adrenal steroid hormone called DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone. That declined dramatically as we get older. So I thought, what if the undiscovered function of DHEA was actually to block this diabetogenic effect of growth hormone? So I did experiments on myself, in fact, and found that, in fact, reliably, the DHEA could block this diabetogenic effect of growth hormone. But as I got older, it was less and less effective. And so I thought, well, if we want to try this in older people, we should have more power. So we added in metformin. So metformin has a number of advantages. It's the most popular anti-diabetic drug in the world. It's been around for a long time. It has a lot of beneficial effects. And it deals with the direct mechanism that we need to deal with, which is insulin insensitivity. Some anti-diabetic medications increase insulin to bring glucose levels down. We don't want to do that. We want to make insulin more effective, and that's what metformin does. So what we find is that the combination of metformin, DHEA, and growth hormone does a pretty good job of controlling insulin and glucose levels in most people, which allows us to have, the ability to regrow the thymus without paying this penalty of having hyperinsulinemia and hyperglycemia.
Just so people know, so the initial TRIIM trial, this was between 2015 and 17. It was 9 or 10 men aged 51 to 65. The results, again, pretty impressive. It was a 2 to 3 year reduction in their apparent ages, improved kidney function, potentially some darkening of hair color. Objectively, you've got the epigenetic age reducing an average of 2.5 years compared to no treatment, and I guess some, protective immunological changes as well. So what happened after that? Because it seems like you would, and maybe there is, and I'm not aware, but is there a larger clinical trial now on this, or?
Yes. So we've launched a series of follow-on trials, generically called the TRIIM-X trial, X standing for extension of the original trial. So by that, we're referring to the fact that the original trial had no women in it, and it had nobody in it older than the age of 65. And so we want to know if there's an age limit for this treatment. So we've expanded the age limit to 80, and I'm going to be expanding that age limit to much higher than that in the near future if I have my way. And we also want to look at other endpoints and make sure that we add on additional modifications to the treatment that might improve it as we go farther. So the original trial, the original follow-on trial, TRIIM-XA, is equivalent to TRIIM-X with a small tweak, and TRIIM-XB is kind of tweaking back to the original protocol. TRIIM-XC is actually a control group in which people either get the metformin and the DHEA but not growth hormone, or they just get nothing, and then we follow them for a year. And then TRIIM-XD is something that we're about to launch, which will be, we hope, a better instantiation of the protocol than what we've been able to do in the past. We actually have another trial that we're about to launch called the Growth Hormone Enhancement Trial, which we hope will be a further gain. And if that works out, then we'll combine that with the rest of the treatment and make that TRIIM-XE. So we are not standing still. We're not staying in one place. We're innovating constantly to try to improve things. But the fundamental bottom line is that our initial results with TRIIM-XA, which involved about 28 people, something like that, 26 people, that has essentially reproduced the results that we published in that original study.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on the use of growth hormone in particular. It's played obviously a pretty big role in the success of some of these studies, but it is a hormone that just seems a little bit controversial in the longevity space, whether, specifically as it relates to potential increases in risk of cancer. Also, just the increases in IGF-1. I'm just wondering, what's your take on growth hormone in general? I guess just in isolation. Do you feel, I think some people think of it as a hormone that may provide some benefit in the short term, but some potential burnout in the long term in terms of aging. How do you counter those? How do you respond to those critics?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of subtopics wrapped into your question. One thing I will say is that people have looked at what the optimum IGF-1 level is for longevity, and it's fairly low. It's like 120 to 150 nanogram per milliliter. And bodybuilders who like to have bigger muscles, they jack their levels up way higher than that. And some of them even take insulin on top of the growth hormone. So they're basically shortening their lifespans by doing that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of the criticism of growth hormone is justified. On the other hand, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater either. One of the other aspects to growth hormone use, and you mentioned cancer, we'll come back to that in a second, but the biogerontologists tend to be against growth hormone because there have been a lot of mouse models that have been developed that indicate that growth hormone is bad and has a life-shortening effect. But unfortunately, most of those models are very misleading because the way that you make those models is you make a mouse that has a defect in growth hormone signaling from the very beginning. And so it has to go through fetal development and adolescence before it grows up to become an adult and then age. That's very abnormal and unnatural. So we're already adults. We can't go back and redo our gestation and all of that kind of stuff. And it turns out that the reason that those models extend lifespan is in large part because they change the wiring of the brain. So the adult brain is set up in such a way that there is an inflammatory response in the brain that helps to program aging in the rest of the body. And that growth hormone deficiency during gestation prevents that from happening. So you artificially have longer lifespans in these animals, but that has nothing to do with normal biology in adult humans. And on top of that, these mouse models, they live long if you control the environment that they're in. If you have them in a nice temperature-controlled vivarium, you put them in a germ-free environment, then they will live longer. But if you put them out in the real world, they'll die immediately because they can't control their body temperature and their immune systems are terrible. It's actually a crippled model. It's not a gateway to longevity in humans because if we had the same kind of defects that these mouse models have, we wouldn't last very long in the real world. So that's not the way forward. The way forward is to recognize that people who have low IGF-1 levels tend to be institutionalized at earlier ages. They tend to have their activities of daily living curtailed at younger ages. And so you need to have a certain amount of growth hormone or IGF-1 in order to have a robust life. But there are limits.
Yeah.
And for example, one of them is this anti-insulin effect that growth hormone has. And that's not the only one. There are other problems with it as well. The answer to the criticism is that you have to do this intelligently. You can't just blindly take growth hormone and nothing else and pay no attention to the consequences. But if you balance everything out in the right way and you administer this in a short period of time so that you can get all the benefits before any of the detrimental effects kick in, then you can back off for a while, let everything settle down, prevent any detrimental effects from happening, and then maybe repeat it again 5 years later. So in this case, if you regrow your thymus and you're producing new immune cells that last for 20 years, you don't need to be on growth hormone longer than it takes to generate those cells. And then as they begin to wear out, you can go back on it again. So I think that's a much more intelligent way of dealing with this issue.
Interesting. So the concept actually, and I wasn't aware of this, is sort of to pulse it, say for several months and then back off and just let this, reprogramming, regeneration happen and then maybe come back to it again at another point.
Yeah. Yeah, because biology is smart, but it's not necessarily geared entirely to optimize our longevity. So we have to give it a little bit of help. But if we push biology too far out of the straight and narrow path that it's on, we could find unknown problems. So it's better to play it safe.
Given your background in pharmacology, I'm just curious about some of the other longevity interventions that are out there, namely rapamycin, various kinds of senolytics. Do you see a role for these and potentially combining them with the TRIIM protocols?
Well, the rapamycin one is the most interesting because, of course, as you know, rapamycin in higher doses is used as an immunosuppressant in humans, so we don't want to use high doses because we want to regrow the thymus. And it turns out that even if you use relatively low levels of rapamycin, like 2.5 milligram per kilogram, if you happen to be a mouse and you do that 5 days a week for a month, which is more than humans would do. Humans would do that more like 5 milligrams once a week, that sort of thing. So it's not exactly comparable, but it's in the same kind of ballpark. Then you cut your thymus weight by about 50%. That's not a good thing. And you also interfere with the development of new T cells in the thymus. So the thymus really needs the mTOR signaling that rapamycin blocks. And so trying to combine that with thymus regeneration is a tricky business at best. But there is a study in old mice that shows that rapamycin given to the old mice actually improved their vaccine responsiveness in one situation. But I think that the problem with that is that there are two ways of dealing with the immune system decline that we all experience. And one of those is to use my approach, which is to generate new immune cells that have a broader range of capabilities than the ones that you had before. And the other approach is to take the old immune cells that you already have, and rather than increasing the number of those by having new ones come in, just improve the functionality of the ones that already exist. And that's a valid thing. So there's a lot of things that you can do to boost up the functionality of existing T cells, and all of that's to the good. But eventually those T cells will still die, and then you'll be out of luck anyway. So I'm afraid that the rapamycin study in mice was done before they ran out of their repertoire of things that they can actually recognize as foreign. So it was still possible to goose up the immune system. But then if that same experiment had been done when they were a bit older, it might not have worked, and it might have actually been counterproductive. So I think you have to be a little bit cautious about rapamycin. There's much more to be learned there, and so I can't give you the final word on how rapamycin might be judiciously used to modulate aging, but I would recommend caution for sure. So as far as senolytics are concerned, there's a very interesting feature to this. First of all, senolytics are agents that kill senescent cells. And one of the things that came out recently is that a good immune system tends to wipe out senescent cells by itself. So if we regrow the thymus, you may find less need to have senolytic agents because the body is smart enough to recognize that those are very abnormal cells and get rid of them. But failing that, sure, if you can get rid of abnormal senescent cells using a drug that's non-toxic, then that's all to the good. So there are many ways of intervening into aging. They hit different aspects of aging. And to the extent that I've been able to, compare them, most of them are compatible with one another. So, just because you want to regrow the thymus doesn't mean you might not want to do other things as well. So I think that there's a lot of exciting potential out there for intervening in aging. But what I would come back to is that no matter what else you do, no matter how successful it is, let's say, for example, you could use reprogramming to take yourself back to the age of 12, you're still going to die because you're going to die of immunosenescence. Because at the age of 12, your thymus is programmed to die. And so just going back to, youth doesn't prevent you from death. You have to go back to the aging clock that starts the whole thing in the first place. But suppose you can program yourself back to 12 and regenerate your thymus, then you have a pretty fantastic combination. So that's the way that I look at it, that everything is good out there that people are doing, but you can't ignore the primacy of the thymus, because without that, everything else becomes futile at some point.
So we've been talking about the thymus and the immune system in the context of longevity, but I'm just curious about applications to other things related to the immune system. For example, is there a role for the protocol in, say, autoimmune disease?
Yes. Yeah, we think so. There are techniques that have been demonstrated in relatively small animals with some encouraging sign in dogs and pigs that hasn't quite gotten, where we want it to go yet, but still good, encouraging signs that if you have a good functioning thymus, you can actually program that thymus to accept anything that you want as self, which means that, for example, if you program the thymus of a given animal to accept a kidney transplant from a different animal as self, then you can transplant that kidney and it will stay in that recipient indefinitely without any need for immunosuppression for the life of that recipient. Same thing with autoimmunity. Part of the problem that we encounter with aging is that the second function of the thymus fails along with the first function. So the first function of the thymus is to generate T cells, which go out and kill things that want to kill us, like bacteria and cancer cells and things like that. But the second function of the thymus is to make sure that those T cells do not kill us. So that's autoimmunity. And as we get older, the screening of T cells to prevent autoimmunity becomes faulty as well. And so we have a greater tendency to become autoimmune. But the same reprogramming of the thymus that can allow a kidney transplant to become a permanent take can also be used to reverse established autoimmune diabetes, for example, which has been shown in animal models. So the reason this hasn't been applied in humans, in large part, is that most people who need organ transplants or autoimmunity to be corrected are old and they don't have much in the way of a thymus. And so key to all of this is to regrow the thymus the way we want to do, and then we can get rid of autoimmunity, which is 80 different diseases, 80 plus different diseases. All could be eliminated using the same kind of basic approach, and to eliminate transplant rejection, so that if you get a kidney, you keep it for 25 years instead of for 5 years, and you don't have to be debilitated with immunosuppressants, and you don't have to die of cancer or an infection if you don't die of organ rejection. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are tremendous potential applications outside of aging per se. And that's one of the things that's on our list of things to do. But we just don't have the resources to do everything at one time. So we're taking it step by step.
Out of curiosity, I know a number of people you mentioned, like in weightlifters and stuff, have started using growth hormone analogs, but also some of the precursors like Simorelin or Tesamorelin. Presumably, those would have the same benefit as using growth hormone, or would there be some nuance there that would not allow that to be have the same effect?
What you're referring to is actually growth hormone releasers. So those agents that you referred to, they cause the pituitary gland to release growth hormone when otherwise it would not. So the reason that our growth hormone levels or IGF-1 levels decline with aging is that somatostatin signaling increases in the brain, and that inhibits the release of growth hormone from the pituitary. And so these agents tend to overcome that and release growth hormone. What I have run into is the fact that they're not very effective. They may be effective in some people, but they're not effective in all people. And we can't have a treatment that's based on something that doesn't work half the time. So we inject growth hormone because that guarantees that the growth hormone goes into your system. So you know at least that much of the system is going to be doing what you want it to do. Now, people respond to that growth hormone differently. Some people are growth hormone resistant. Some people are not. And so, the IGF-1 response that you get varies from person to person. But at least you don't have a problem with the first step in the process, which is getting the growth hormone into the system in the first place. Now, if we found a growth hormone releaser that we really liked, that would be very attractive because growth hormone is costly. And these releasers tend to be a lot cheaper. And so we'd love to be able to reduce the cost of the treatment so more people can afford it. But we're just not satisfied with anything that we've experimented with so far.
Well, one of the reasons I was asking also about that was over the course of a 12-month trial, just clinically, being a physician myself, I would think, a lot of people who are on growth hormone and then they get off of it, bodybuilders have a really bad period where they're, essentially having not withdrawal, but they just feel miserable when they first get off of it. Is there anything that you typically have done with these patients in the trials to mitigate that?
I think one problem is that when you're on growth hormone, you tend to feel younger and more energetic. And when that's taken away, of course, you notice it, you don't like it, but there's not much we can do about that other than putting you back on the treatment again, which of course is not our idea. So, that problem arose in the very first human aging intervention study done with growth hormone by Rudman back in 1980. And he mentioned at the end of the paper that when the people had to be taken off growth hormone at the end of the trial, they really didn't like that. They wanted to stay on it, but thought it was very sad at the time. But at the moment, that's the way it kind of has to be, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to just, before I let you go, just talk a little bit about cryopreservation and human longevity. I mean, that's not something, I've heard very much of. Could you talk a little bit about what cryopreservation is and maybe some of the feasibility of it for humans in the future?
Yeah, so cryopreservation is preservation at cryogenic temperatures, which for, a rule of thumb, you might say, is any temperature below like minus 120 degrees Celsius. So it's very, very cold. So it's temperatures that are cold enough to arrest all changes in a biological system over time. I've been pursuing that because of the same topic of organ transplantation that we've been talking about before. So if you receive a kidney transplant, you might keep it for 5 years. Meanwhile, the surgery to do that is like $250,000. The immunosuppressants that you have to be on are like $20,000 a year, if not more. And you have all kinds of limitations and so on and so forth. So what if we could just get rid of all of that? Give you a kidney transplant. You keep that as like it's your twin brother's kidney or your own kidney. No immunosuppression, no life shortening, no risk of infection because you're not on immunosuppressants, et cetera. Well, that's what we could do if we could take the kidney and put it into a bank, because the way that the thymus works to control transplant rejection requires a certain period of preconditioning of the thymus. So you can use cells from the donated organ to reprogram the thymus over a few months of time while the kidney sits in the bank. And then when you take the kidney out of the bank and put it into the recipient's ready for it. The recipient's immune system has already been cleared out of all of the cells that would reject that kidney. And so now you can put the kidney in and everything is hunky-dory. And it doesn't matter who that kidney comes from, so you don't have to worry about tissue matching. And I think that even if you were to transplant, say, a humanized pig kidney, you could still accept that as though it was yourself. And so I think that the potential for this kind of thing is tremendous, but it does require time. And there's no other technology that can put an organ on hold for 2 or 3 months while the thymus is reprogrammed. So you have to be able to cool the kidney to a deep cryogenic temperature, and that arrests biological time. And of course, if you could do that for a kidney, you could do that for heart or liver, and maybe even someday for a brain, something like that. Then you start talking about even different possibilities for life extension. So I think that the potential of the field is pretty great. I'm a kind of a fan of Elon Musk also, and Elon has pointed out that ultimately for the future survival of humanity, we have to be a spacefaring civilization, but space is pretty big and it takes a long time to get from point A to point B. And if you have to be eating food that entire time, it makes the trip more difficult. But if you could put yourself into suspended animation for 100 years or whatever, then we could go a lot of different places that might be more conducive to our survival. So I think that what I'm working on has implications for not only the immediate prospects of individual life extension for us as individuals, but also for our species. So that's another reason that I work on it.
Fascinating stuff. Where can people learn more about some of your work? Obviously, we've mentioned some of the trials for non-scientists who are just kind of, interested in kind of just poking around. I mean, some of what the TRIIM stuff, got my attention as somebody who is interested in longevity for myself. Is there any other resources that you would recommend?
Well, we do have a couple of websites. The Intervene Immune is the company that's doing the TRIIM study. And I think if you just type www.interveneimmune.com, you will find it. There's a lot of information on the trials and on what we've done in the past and some of the news articles that have been written about us and things like that in there. And it provides the rationale for the treatment and some of the details and hopefully contact information that you can use. You can also write to me at Fahy@interveneimmune.com. That's INTERVENE, immune.com, all one word. And the last name is FAHY, and there's no E in the last name. Or if you want to, get connected more directly, you can write to grace@interveneimmune.com, because Grace is the person who will actually tell you all about what it takes to get enrolled in one of our trials. And as far as the cryobiology is concerned, you can go to www.21cm.com, 21cm.com. That's for 21st Century Medicine. That's the biotechnology company that's doing the organ cryopreservation research.
Thank you so much. I've really appreciated fascinating conversation and would love to have you back at some point, Dr. Fahy.
Sure. It's been a pleasure, Buck. Thank you for your interest.